Should Dillian Whyte fire his new coach, Xavier? Now, I'm going to address that question a little bit later on in this video, but the reason I'm asking it is because, as most of you know, it's quite common for fighters to fire their coaches after they've taken a loss. Now, in some instances, it's the right decision. And it isn't necessarily a case of their trainer being a bad trainer or a bad coach. It's just that he wasn't the right fit for them. He couldn't get the best out of that particular fighter, because there is no one-size-fits-all trainer for every boxer. Different fighters have different personalities, and a lot of it is down to whether the personality of the trainer and the fighter can actually gel. There's also the technical aspect of things. Most trainers teach a particular style, and they have a particular philosophy on boxing. And the style they teach and the philosophy they have might not be right for every fighter, because different fighters have got different attributes. As I say, different personalities, different innate fighting ability. So it's about finding the trainer that is the right trainer for the fighter. Not just going out there looking for the trainer who has the most world champions necessarily. It's about finding the right trainer for that fighter's abilities, his personality, etc., etc., and in terms of what he needs technically. Now, I'll give you some examples of when, well, first of all, when a fighter changed trainer and it was a good thing. And at the time, it seemed surprising. It seemed a strange move, even to me. I thought it was a strange move and I was kind of concerned about it. But in retrospect, it turned out to be a fantastic move. When Tyson Fury fired Ben Davison, well, I don't want to say he fired him, but he basically demoted him to assistant coach, and he brought Javon Sugar Hill in as the head coach. He had initially wanted Ben Davison to stay on, but Ben Davison didn't want to play second fiddle, so he decided to walk. But either way, they split. It was, Tyson Fury who made the decision that he needed somebody else in there. He felt like Ben Davison wasn't really teaching him anything new. And Tyson Fury obviously knew his ability and knew that he could fight in a different way against Deontay Wilder in the rematch. And Ben Davison wasn't the guy to be able to, teach him what he needed or help sharpen the tools needed to fight Deontay Wilder aggressively second time around. So he hired Javon Sugar Hill, the trainer at the Kronk Gym in Detroit, and he was the perfect match for Tyson Fury, at least for that particular fight. So this is an example of when a guy changed trainer and it was absolutely the right thing to do. And of course, in this instance, it was a guy changing trainer when he hadn't taken a loss. And I always prefer fighters to do this. I always prefer a fighter to change the coach before something goes wrong. Because a lot of fighters, they'll stick with a coach out of loyalty, even though deep down in their heart, they know this is not the right guy for me. This is not the trainer who can get the best out of me. And that's the case with Tyson Fury. He was loyal to Ben Davison and he wanted to keep him on as part of the team. But deep down, he knew that if he wanted to continue learning and elevate his game to the next level, he'd need to bring a different coach in, which is what he did. So Tyson Fury didn't make the mistake that most fighters make, sticking on with a trainer who can't take them to that next level. They wait until they get beat, then they fire the trainer. Whereas if they would have fired the trainer and got with a more appropriate trainer before the loss, they might not have lost at all. So that's an example of somebody who did it at the right time. And again, it was alarming to me, especially given how close it was to his rematch with Wilder. But obviously, Fury knew what he was doing and it worked out for the best. Now, an example of changing your trainer where it doesn't necessarily turn out for the best, although I do think this trainer brought some things to Lennox Lewis's game. But early on in Lewis's career, he was trained by a guy called John Davenport. And after his 19th fight here against Levi Billups, which Lewis won on a 10-round unanimous decision, he decided to fire John Davenport. And the reason for that is that John Davenport was like a drill sergeant. He was a very overbearing character and very domineering of his fighters. And Lennox Lewis didn't like that. Him and Davenport had a clash of personalities, and Lewis decided to fire the guy. He then hired Pepe Correa. Now, Pepe Correa had worked with Sugar Ray Leonard and, other fighters. But Correa was as much a cheerleader as he was a promoter. And I'm just being real. I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but Pepe Correa was a guy who was always front and center at the Lennox Lewis press conferences, at Lennox Lewis interviews. He was always the one in the camera actually promoting Lennox Lewis more than Lewis himself. And again, this is a trainer, not a promoter. So Pepe Correa was a guy who used to like to try and instill confidence in his fighters by telling them how great they were. And that's what he did with Lennox Lewis. But in terms of the technical aspect of boxing, there was a lot left to be desired. There was a lot to be desired in terms of what he was teaching Lewis, because Lewis was not the finished article and he was not technically as good as he was ever going to be under Pepe Correa. I think Pepe Correa got Lewis to utilize his feet more in movement, because Pepe Correa was a fan of Muhammad Ali and what have you. So was Lennox Lewis. And personality-wise, they gelled more because, well, Pepe Correa just told Lennox everything he wanted to hear, just told him how great he was, and there really wasn't much authority that Pepe Correa had over Lennox Lewis. Again, not to say that he necessarily needs authority over him, but he probably needed more than a yes man, and that's what Pepe Correa was. So yeah, he taught Lewis, he got Lewis to utilize his feet a bit more once Pepe Correa took over, but ultimately Lewis was still making a lot of technical mistakes, which would cost him in his first professional loss against Oliver McCall. Now, after the Oliver McCall loss, which is here, the first fight, Lewis made the interesting move of actually taking Oliver McCall's trainer, because Oliver McCall was trained by Manny Steward in this fight. So after the fight, Manny Steward said he was very surprised to get a phone call from Lennox Lewis. When he just trained McCall to knock Lewis out, Lewis calls up McCall's trainer and says, "Can you train me?" So Manny Steward was very surprised. He wasn't under long-term contract with Oliver McCall or anything like that. So he said yes. And Manny Steward actually said that he was a fan of Lennox Lewis. He'd been admiring him for a long time and had his eye on him. He was one of those kind of fighters that he really wanted to train, but didn't think he'd get the opportunity. So Lewis hooked up with Manny Steward after the McCall fight, and then he was with him for the rest of his career. And of course, Lewis improved a lot technically under Manny Steward. Manny Steward was never really a drill sergeant type trainer. He wasn't the cheerleader that Pepe Correa was, but he also wasn't as overbearing and drill sergeant-ish as John Davenport. I mean, John Davenport, I guess, kind of similar to Teddy Atlas, overbearing with the fighter and what have you. So Lewis needed kind of somebody who was going to teach him the right things technically, not be a cheerleader, but also, not take no BS either. You understand? So he hooked up with Manny Steward, who was very experienced, had lots of world champions, and it was a great pairing between them. However, Lewis lost the fight under Manny Steward to Hasim Ratman, their first fight in South Africa. Now, after the fight, Manny Steward said that he expected Lennox Lewis, or a representative of Lewis's team, to call him up and tell him that he'd been fired. That didn't happen. Lewis kept Manny Steward on. And the reason he kept Manny Steward on and didn't fire him is because he realized that the mistakes he made in the first Ratman fight were his own fault. They weren't Manny Steward's fault. It was a case of him not listening to his trainer. It was a case of him being lackadaisical, taking Hasim Ratman too lightly. He was out in LA filming some kind of movie. He arrived in South Africa just a few days before the fight, and this is in Johannesburg, where it's at altitude. And if you're not used to the altitude, it's going to take a hell of a lot out of you. And that's exactly what happened. Lewis looked very slow and lethargic. He came in at his career heaviest. He was winning the fight, I guess, but he ended up getting knocked out in the 5th round. And as I say, he realized it was his own fault. It wasn't Manny Steward's fault. So he got himself in much better shape for the rematch, listened to everything Manny Steward said, went out there and put on a masterclass performance and knocked Hasim Rahman out. So, as I say, it's on a case-by-case basis. Sometimes it's the right thing to do, as with Tyson Fury firing or, splitting with Ben Davison. That was the right decision. Lewis splitting with Pepe Correa after he lost to Oliver McCall. That was the right decision. Yeah. Other times, it's not really the right decision. And that's why Lewis didn't split with Manny Steward when he lost to Rahman, because it was his own fault, not Steward's fault. So getting back to Dillian Whyte. Now, Dillian Whyte, of course, recently fired Mark Tibbs. Then he hooked up with Xavier Miller. Now, Xavier Miller has been kind of part of Team Whyte, to my knowledge, in the background for a while. So he isn't a complete stranger or anything like that. And I guess Dillian Whyte liked the things that Xavier Miller had taught him over the years. And if you look at the Povetkin fight, obviously up until the 5th round where Whyte gets knocked out, you can see improvements there. So I wouldn't be so quick to advise Dillian to get rid of Xavier Miller. Look, Dylan's going to make his own decisions. He's not looking for advice from any of us anyway. All right, I get that. But personally, I wouldn't be so quick to say Dillian needs to fire Xavier Miller, because there were improvements in there under this guy. And I also think he should retain Dave Coldwell, because Dave Coldwell during the fight, I've watched the fight a few times now, Dave Coldwell during the fight was talking about Dillian Whyte's footwork. Dillian Whyte's footwork still needs a hell of a lot of improvement. I like the things he was doing in terms of, especially against a guy like Povetkin, who's very dangerous with the mid-range and close-range hooks, often as counters, but also leads. Dillian Whyte was keeping his hands up far more than normal. Normally, Dillian Whyte likes to fight with his left hand low, or relatively low. This time, his hands were up very high. Also, his jab seemed a lot more solid in this fight than I've seen it before. He was really busting Povetkin up with a jab. So there were improvements there. And therefore, I don't think it's the right time to get rid of Xavier Miller if he gets rid of him at all. I think he should keep him on for now, particularly going into the Povetkin rematch. And I think that Dave Coldwell's a good addition. Hopefully, Dave Coldwell's input with regards to Dillian Whyte's footwork is listened to, and they can sort his feet out. Because there was somebody, I can't remember who it was now, but they said that Dillian Whyte has still got a kickboxer's footwork. And you can actually see that. He does. His feet often come together quite frequently, as they do with kickboxers. So he's still got a lot of the kickboxing in him with regards to the footwork, and he needs to get that out of him. Because when you got that kind of see, that kind of footwork works for kickboxing, but for boxing, it's sloppy. And in a sport where a split second can make the difference between winning and losing, you can't afford to be sloppy. So hopefully Dave Coldwell sorts that footwork out. Xavier Miller did a good job in terms of what he got Dillian Whyte to do. Getting that jab nice and solid, being economical with his shots. His positioning, other than exchanging with Povetkin too much on the inside, his positioning was fairly good in terms of where he was in the ring, utilizing his reach, keeping it long, all that kind of stuff. I mean, Dillian Whyte really got caught because he chose to fight up close. He didn't get caught up close because Povetkin was just relentlessly walking him down and Dillian Whyte had nowhere to go. No, that wasn't the case. Dillian Whyte willingly chose to engage up close. Yeah, so that was his mistake. And to be fair, in between rounds, I heard Xavier Miller saying don't exchange with him this early. So he seemed to be giving good advice. Dave Coldwell seemed to be giving good advice. But I guess Dillian Whyte just got too comfortable in there. So long story short, I would say, at least for now, to stick with Xavier Miller and Dave Coldwell going into the Povetkin rematch. If the rematch doesn't work out well, maybe you reassess at that point And even then, it doesn't necessarily mean you should fire Xavier Miller or Caldwell. You just reassess again. But as I say, I've seen improvements under Xavier Miller the few months that he's been Dillian Whyte's head coach. And just because he got caught with one shot, I mean, they don't have to improve that much from a technical point of view, in my opinion, to be able to beat Povetkin. It's just the mental aspect of this situation that I'm really unsure about. Because when a guy has knocked you out, almost out cold with one punch in a fight you were winning comfortably, that is a heavy psychological burden to carry in there with you, for the rematch, especially an immediate rematch. Sometimes fighters can be really spooked when something like that happens. And next time they get in there, solid jabs have got them wobbling, Whereas before they would have been able to take certain shots after that experience, that traumatic experience of being knocked out so suddenly, everything seems to be hurting them. And we don't know whether that's going to be the case with Dillian Whyte here. As many of us have pointed out in the past, Dillian Whyte's punch resistance hasn't really seemed to be the same since that AJ fight. Because in the AJ fight, he took tremendous shots throughout that 6 and a bit rounds. It ended in the 7th. He took tremendous shots from AJ without going to the canvas. But as I say, once his chin was cracked there, he's been getting hurt in a lot of fights, dropped in a lot of fights, and of course, knocked out in this fight against Povetkin. So let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Should Dillian Whyte fire his new trainer, Xavier Miller? Some of you probably feel like he should try and make peace with Mark Tibbs and go back with him. I personally don't think so. I'm not dissing Mark Tibbs or anything like that. Again, Mark Tibbs is a excellent trainer. But I saw improvements under Xavier Miller that weren't there in Dillian Whyte's previous fights, So if that's the case, then there's obviously good things that Miller has brought to the table. So I don't know. If you guys disagree and you think he should get back with Mark Tibbs, that's perfectly fine. At the end of the day, these are just opinions and the proof is in the pudding. We'll see what happens for the rest of Dillian Whyte's career. But yeah, let me know what you think. Should he get rid of Xavier Miller? Maybe some of you think he should maybe make Dave Caldwell the head coach and have Xavier Miller as kind of as an assistant. Let me know what you think. It's happening. I'm out. Join me on Patreon. I upload a minimum of 2 podcasts every single week, covering a wide variety of controversial topics, as well as live stream Q&A sessions. Take a look on screen right now at some of the podcasts I've produced so far. For just $3 a month, the equivalent of about £2 a month, you get access to all my new podcasts and my entire back catalogue of past podcasts, including my popular Confessions of a Nightclub Bouncer series. You can listen on your computer or on your smartphone or tablet by downloading the Patreon app from the Google Play Store or the App Store for free. The Patreon app also allows you to download each podcast in MP3. For less than the price of a cup of coffee, you get access to dozens of hours of exclusive content. It's easy to sign up, there's no contract, and you can cancel at any time. So come and join our community of free and critical thinkers by signing up with me here on Patreon today.